fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 13, Risk Management. The angry staccato of Miranda's stiletto heels leading them to their doom filled the space between Lucas's ears, clouding out his ability to think rationally. The pain in his face wasn't helping either, he thought blearily. But despite their march to the gallows, his thoughts kept turning to Undine. He stole a glance at the warrior dryad, but she was pointedly not looking at him, or the others, as she held her chin high and kept a soldier's posture as she walked. He'd thought they were friends, or at least comrades in misery, but her veiled comment played over and over in his mind. They moved through crowded corridors filled with panicking guests and harried staff until they reached the gap. It was the longest period of time Lucas had gone without hearing the Arcanist talk. Apparently, he was too scared to speak, a sentiment he shared as they vaulted the gap one after the other before slinking into the room she gestured at with a rigid jerk of her hand. His heart trembled against his ribs as he stared at the faces of the statues shelved on Miranda's many bookshelves. In the light of several glowing green balls of fire, their faces stretched and twisted as if to wail at them to flee before they wound up on the shelves as well. There was a pointed click of a latch behind them, loud as the final nail in the coffin, and Miranda pushed through the group, stomping around to stand behind her desk. She leaned over it, struggling to force calm through her veins. With a lick of her lips, she snapped her fingers and the 4 customary chairs appeared behind the ragtag crew that had become painful thorns in her side as of late. Sit. Atlas, forever hoping to please the woman, complied without a breath, ignorant or oblivious to the pure venom dripping from the manager's single word. He ran a hand through his hair, stammering, "Miss Miranda, I can explain." "Silence!" Miranda drew a straight line out in front of her with her fingers, and smiled as a puff of green magic snapped the Arcanist's mouth shut, binding his lips. Her hands moved to grip the desk as she forewent her syrupy demeanor. "Do you 4 have any idea the amount of damage you have caused?" She straightened her back, rubbing her fingers across her cheeks. 10,000 cleaning pixies, dead. That chandelier was older than time, and the most valuable thing any of you have ever seen. She narrowed her eyes as her snakes began to uncoil themselves from her braid. And that's to say nothing of the bellhop or the guest that were lost to the pool. Squirming and tugging at his mouth, Atlas struggled to speak around lips that refused to open. He made several grunts and turned a pleading eye toward Undine. Bram spoke instead, mumbling,
"Well, she started it."
Lucas caught sight of the throb in Miranda's temple and jumped in before she could erupt. "That's to say that, the woman that fell into the pool wasn't a guest." When her attention slowly fell on him, he swallowed hard and silently wished he had stayed silent. "Then who was she?" "I don't know." Lucas glanced at the Arcanist. "I think she's a crazy ex-girlfriend, hell-bent on devouring Atlas. She's been stalking us before we even came here." Atlas groaned, mumbling against his spelled lips. "I don't care." Miranda rhythmically tapped her fingernails hard enough against the desk that they left indents. "Whatever the reasons behind this incident, they won't unsink a priceless artifact or bring back my entire staff of pixies." She studied him for a long, tense moment, her snakes bobbing with anticipation and the itch to add another statue to her collection. Then a gentle knock at her door froze her nails mid-tap, the color draining from her face. Shaking, she held up a hand and moved around her desk. "For the love of whatever gods you pray to, be silent," Miranda hissed as she reached for the doorknob, pausing in an attempt to compose herself. Forcing her perfected work smile on her face, she mustered the courage and opened the door. The other side was a wall of nothing, like the darkest recesses of a black hole. Lower management. A nervous chuckle fell from her quivering lips as she gazed up into the void. What an unexpected... The room shook, causing the magic binding Atlas to snap free from his face, and he let out a heavy sigh, careful to remain as silent as possible. His eye teared up involuntarily as he tried to take in the darkened presence blocking out the light from the hall. It felt as if he were staring into the brightest part of a bonfire, but more painful. A roiling, pitch-black beast was attempting to force itself inside. Tentacles of shadow pushed past the doorframe, leaching the color out of their surroundings as they latched onto the ceiling, the floor, the bookshelves. A large seam tore open across its front to reveal a terrifying scowl of perfect human-shaped teeth, followed by a random spatter of smaller slits that each opened into eyes all across its surface, their shade the same eerie, glowing green as the little wisps that hung in the air around them. And then the horror began to speak. Lucas felt the low, guttural sound in his chest. It was clipped and sharp, and any semblance of sanity he thought he had been holding on to began to crumble like a sandcastle in the tide of this corporeal nightmare. Miranda remained rooted on the spot, one hand clutching the door to keep herself upright. Yes, I understand. Her other hand had moved to the hem of her veil, keeping it pinned down over her face as the verbal lashing from lower management threatened to remove it entirely. No, of course not, sir. I can explain. The rebuttal from the eldritch creature was so loud the room shook, and Lucas spun, searching for anything to anchor his mind to. The only thing he could spy in the waning light were the shelves filled with howling faces of stone. That wasn't helping. And then he saw it. Tucked into a dark corner was the saddest-looking cactus housed in a coffee mug that read "Number 1 Boss," an anchor in the storm. Behind him, the verbal lashing continued long enough that Lucas felt his fears ebbing into disassociation as he stared down at the withered, dried-up cactus. "Hello, friend," he whispered, his fingers shaking as he moved it closer to the light. He heard the faintest wheezing cough in return. It was alive, but barely. Refusing the reality around him, he dedicated his mind to a singular task: take care of the plant. But he had no water, no plant food. He did, however, recall the image of moss and tiny white flowers blooming from a pool of his own blood. He ran a hand across his face, wiping a small streak from his slowly oozing nose, and pressed it against the soil at the base of the plant. He waited, some tiny part of him hoping that what he had seen earlier was all just a hallucination. I mean, magic blood? But when color began to blossom over the ashen cactus, and he heard a ragged gasp come from the plant, he gave a shaky, mildly insane chuckle. The slamming of a door and stomping of heels on hardwood snapped him free of the spell, wrenching his mind back into place. He shook the fog from his brain, set the cactus back down, and looked up to see even Miranda was visibly shaken, the rich, rosy hue of her skin having faded, giving her a pallid, uneven color. The snakes in her hair had buried themselves back into her braid, and when she reached her chair, she collapsed into it with a long sigh, her hand fluttering up to her veil. Afraid she was about to remove the damn thing and turn them all to stone, Atlas lurched forward. "Oh, Mom? Get out!" Miranda interrupted him, using her free hand to flick toward the door. Their chairs disappeared, and Atlas, the only one who had actually sat in the first place, collapsed to the floor. The others reached to pull him to his feet, but before they could, they all found themselves once again unceremoniously teleported outside the office, staring down at the massive, blackened pit. Atlas, nose to nose with the hole, could see it now, something that had gone unnoticed in their previous visits. Lower management, carved into a single floorboard. They all backed away from the chasm, and he let out a long exhale of relief as they hauled him up. Oh, I am surprised we were not skewered on the spot. Undine ran a hand through her hair, whisking away the flop sweat that had built up on her forehead. If you had to guess, how much trouble are we in? Atlas threw his hands behind his head, falling back into his lackadaisical pose. My elder speech is a bit rusty, but I understood enough to know that I'm gonna go to the bar and get absolutely shit-faced before Miranda summons us back.
Do they sell rum at this fine facility?
Captain Bram inclined his head towards the Commodore.
I should very much like to participate in this act of becoming shit-faced.
Atlas barked a laugh. Of course they do, buddy. He threw an arm around the machine, and side by side with Undine, the three of them hopped the gap. Once again, Lucas was left scrabbling to catch up, his eyes flicking between the blackened hole in the floor and the manager's office. He threw out a cautionary, whispered apology to lower management before he bolted to catch up with the others. He agreed. After something like that, even he wouldn't mind forgetting for a bit. Nothing soothed a disquieted mind like work. Danny knew this well as she went about her day, the 7th one in a row to be exact, unofficially performing duties as Prime Minister in her father's absence. Much of it she could do without him, but not all. She signed papers, oversaw deliveries, and even approved a construction project, the rebuilding of the campus. But at every lull in her day, every quiet moment, she found herself succumbing to the fear she had buried within, doing her best to repress the memory that kept her frayed and exhausted. Often she would look to her left, where her father normally stood, and a pang of sadness would throw her off balance whenever she saw it empty. As the sun sank lower in the sky, she sighed and turned over her wrists. The manacles bound there were chafing, and the skin beneath had grown red and angry. Danny ached to remove them, to wash and smooth a salve over her raw skin, but every time her fingers moved for one, she was reminded of what her brother sacrificed to keep her safe. Maybe she could take a quick detour. Yes, that is what she would do. Danny set down her clipboard on the Prime Minister's cluttered desk and turned to leave the room, flipping the lights off as she left. The streets were busy, as usual, but a tense atmosphere choked the air. Citizens were still terrified by the glowing shield that surrounded their city, and many of them stared up at the floating chunks of land and rubble that gently banged against the bubble, attempting to reunite with their broken halves on this side. She could feel their worries. It was a palpable thing in the air, but Danny knew there was nothing she could do for them right now. The scholar had informed them all that it would protect them from Elias and his dark magic, something her nightmares were quick to remind her in the dark. Those purple eyes and twisting horns. She shook the thoughts from her head, crossed the busy road carefully, and pulled open the door to the hospital. She checked in with the nurse at the desk and received an escort up to the 3rd-floor wing of the hospital, one reserved for military ranks. Abandoned at the elevator doors, Danny walked by empty rooms or crowded chairs, and the burning stench of disinfectant clung to every corridor. She rounded a final corner and was met by a hall that held only a single room at its end. Her boots echoed noisily in the silent hallway as she made her way toward the man slumped in the chair outside the door. Chester, who had forsaken all his civic duties, was fighting a losing battle with exhaustion, giving ground with every slow blink or nod of the head. A familiar sound of boots clacking off tiles pulled the tired from his eyes, and he looked up, a faint smile breaking over his unshaven face.
"Ah, Danny."
He didn't bother to ask why she was here. It was the same reason as his. She pulled to a stop at the sight of her father. He looked more spectre than man, his skin pale enough to match the new silver streaks in his pallid hair. Deep purple rings lined his tired eyes, and the light and life had left him. She sighed sadly as she dragged over an empty chair and sat down beside him. "You look terrible. When was the last time you slept?" A faint, hollow laugh scraped past chapped lips, that gentle smile never fading from Chester's face, though it had lost its joy.
"I can't. Not while they continually refuse to let me see Theodore."
"Still?" Danny looked over at the door. The curtains to the room's only window were drawn, and judging by the fact that her father was out here and not in there, the door was locked. She relaxed into a slouch and reached over to take one of the Prime Minister's hands in hers. They were dry, rough, and tense with anxiety. "I can wait here if you want to go home. You could shower, and I left a meal in the icebox for you. There's also a stack of things I need your approval on sitting in your office."
"I don't give a damn about work."
Chester pulled his hand back.
"And I don't deserve to rest."
"Father, please. I can stay here for the night." Chester interrupted her by jolting to his feet. His fingers gripped around the arms of his chair, and he flung it down the hallway.
"I'm not leaving!"
His chest heaved with his failed attempts to control his anger. He dug his fingers into his hair, gripping at it, before exhaustion drained the rage from him and he slumped to his knees. Tears were burning at him as he crouched down on the floor, staring at the haunting reflection of himself in its mirrored surface.
"Thousands are still missing. More than that are confirmed dead. My best friend has disappeared, and despite all that, I can't bring myself to care."
Chester stifled back a wail with a soul-steadying sigh.
"All I can think about is I've already lost Piper and Atticus."
He looked up at his daughter.
"And the two of you could be next. How am I supposed to return to work?"
"I'm not going anywhere." Danny sank to the floor before her father, holding his hands. "And Theodore, well, you wouldn't believe how strong he is. Stronger than the both of us, I think." She managed a faint smile. "He was there for me when I was bullied in the orphanages for being small and silent. And every time I was let down by a failed adoption, he lifted me back up. And..." Tears leaked from her eyes. "He was the only one there for me when I knew I was no longer Nathaniel." She let out a wet laugh. "He gave me the name Danielle." She sniffled. "I might deny it, but he's always been the strong one." Chester took in a deep, shaky breath.
"I'm sorry I wasn't there for you."
"You didn't even know about us. How could you blame yourself?"
"That doesn't matter. I wasn't there."
He gripped his daughter's hands in his, her hold helping to ground him.
"And if I'm not here for him now and something happens, how could I live with myself?"
"How can I fix this?" The words ran through Danny's mind before an idea came to her. She stood, pulling her father to his feet with ease, and turned toward the door. With her free hand, she wiped the tears from her face and said, "Come with me."
"I told you I'm not leaving."
Chester resisted, worried she would haul him away. "And neither am I. We're going in. That way you can see him. See that he's all right, because I know he is. And then you can go home and take care of yourself."
Danny reached for the handle and tested the door. It was indeed locked, but with a quick twist, the flimsy metal shattered beneath her strength. The door swung wide, and before anyone could protest, Danny strode in. The room was cold, and the tinny smell of iron overrode the stench of disinfectant. And in the center, strapped to a table designed to splay out his arms and legs, was Theodore, saved from immodesty by a single white sheet covering his lower body. Danny's hand flew to cover her mouth as she took in the horrifying sight of the damage her brother received from Elias. His left arm was nearly dismembered at the muscle between the shoulder and the neck, his skin shredded and torn like a flag in the wind, and there were fist-sized purple crystals protruding from the softest parts of his flesh. But it was his skin that caused her to run to his side. He was pale, stiff, and blue. And when she lowered a hand to his still chest, he was cold to the touch. Doctors, frozen in the act of removing crystals, metal tongs hovering over several, stared at them in surprise, faces hidden behind paper masks and eye shields.
"Hey, you're not supposed to be here,"
one of them cried out, moving towards the pair.
They had lied. "What is this?"
Danny's voice quivered with shock and anger. Her father had fallen silent behind her. When the doctor placed his hand on her shoulder, she grabbed it and twisted.
"You said you were saving him!"
She wrenched harder, forcing the man to his knees when she heard the warning creak of bones and tendon reaching their threshold.
"What are you doing to my brother? Harvesting him?"
Another doctor moved forward, but stumbled back quickly when Danny turned her gaze on him. He fell into a tray that contained one of the removed crystals, and everything hit the ground with a clatter. Someone screamed and ran.
"Please."
A gentle, warming voice filled the space of awkward silence. Stepping out from the adjoining room, a tall figure moved into the beam of light with a slight bow of his golden mask.
"Calm yourselves before your ignorance kills us all."
Chester placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, finding his center at last. At his touch, she relinquished her grip, and the doctor fled to the opposite end of the room, clutching his wrist with a sob. Reaching for some sort of mental purchase, the Prime Minister looked up at the living god.
What is this? Why didn't you tell me my son was dead?"
The scholar inclined his head to one side.
"Because he is not dead."
He took a step forward, gesturing to the tubes in his wrists, the cuffs and sigils scrawled into the leather.
"Everything you see here is keeping Theodore in what we call a state of suspended animation. This allows us to perform the delicate art of removing the crystals and suturing him up without the fear of him bleeding out."
His feet moved of their own accord, and Chester found himself standing as close to his son as the other doctors would allow. He reached out with a shaking hand and placed it against the arm closest to him, and he immediately withdrew it. His skin was cold, ice cold.
"So, he's not dead?"
Chester turned, tears burning behind his eyes. Placing a hand on the Prime Minister's worried shoulders, the scholar shook his head.
"Not at all. He is simply frozen in a moment. And once we have removed all the shards that prevent him from healing naturally, we will stitch him back together and move him to a room insulated from magic, where you can visit to your heart's content."
Chester was hardly aware that he was being coaxed towards the door. He glanced over his shoulder, taking one final look at his son, to the deep red blood moving sluggishly through the tubes, the only sign that he was truly still alive.
"Not dead, just frozen."
Her father was in shock, Danny could tell, and she should go to him.
but she wasn't ready to leave just yet. She moved around to her brother's head and, leaning down, whispered against his ear, "Please don't make me face this new world without you. You promised." She waited a breath, as if he would open his eyes and respond, but he remained motionless. She planted a kiss on his cold forehead, and with a jerk pulled away, reaching for Chester. She grabbed the Prime Minister's hand and led him through the open door. "Come on, Father. Let's get you home. I'll come back once you're settled." She paused, looking over her shoulder at the scholar. "I'm sorry for not trusting you. Thank you." The scholar offered a slight bow in return and watched them depart, tracking every stumble, sob, or hitched breath the pair made before he gently shut the door. After a breath, he spoke.
"Do not touch that if you value your existence."
He turned slowly to see the voice of the jewel, Charles Brightworth, stooping down to pick up the fallen crystal.
"We must be careful with those, Charles,"
the scholar warned as he reached for a pair of metal tongs. He crouched, retrieving the glittering gem. He examined it in the beam of light, checking for signs of damage. Deep purple swirled beneath the surface, like the turbulent ocean during a storm.
"If Ruby fails to find the first portal, we will need every bit of Ravaria's magic to force our way in from the other side."
Lucas had declined the Arcanist's invitation to join him in this bar on more than one occasion, but as he walked over the threshold of the Dire Liar Tavern, he suddenly wished he had taken the man up on the offer sooner. The entire place had been built to resemble an old lodge cabin, with wood panels on the walls resembling large logs of timber and open rafters that held several antler chandeliers, each one burning with candles. The bar itself was one giant slab of ancient oak, polished to a shine with a flat surface and hundreds of different colored levers to dispense a myriad of drinks to waiting patrons. There were booths and benches, pool tables and lounge chairs, and even something that resembled a beanbag toss, but with pentagrams and potatoes? Lucas frowned at that as Atlas led them to an empty table. This being a hotel for the gods, the bar was teeming with the divine. The handsome Herculean group, including Byron, were huddled around one of the pool tables, flexing their might with each strike of the cues. There were animal-headed gods lounging languidly in gold-coated chairs, while a group of haggard crones took turns making the fires in the candles of the nearest chandelier grow into jets of flame. There was a raucous cheer at the bar, and Lucas turned to see a rowdy group of Viking-like deities, each one sporting beards and braids, cheering at a large, sideways magic mirror on the wall. Obviously in lieu of a TV. He had no idea what they were watching, but enjoyed their camaraderie nonetheless. Turning back to his own table, Lucas hadn't even noticed the Arcanist's disappearance until he returned with 3 small glasses and a bottle of rum for their robotic companion. "Sit, drink." He hesitantly sat down into the chair beside Undine, who visibly shied away from him, and took his drink.
"All right. So, I have a plan to get hold of our contracts."
Atlas threw back his glass, the warm alcohol soothing his frayed nerves and bringing a warm flush to his cheeks. "No." Undine followed suit, hissing over the bitter taste of her drink, and then smacked her lips as the flavor transformed into something desirable in her mouth. "We need to lay low for a bit." With a bark of incredulous laughter, Atlas set his glass down on the table, where it refilled instantly.
"Excuse me? You've been the loudest voice for leaving, aside from myself, since we got here."
He tossed back his drink as fast as the first one.
"So, help me figure out the best way to break into Miranda's office and steal our way to freedom."
"That's your plan." Lucas rolled his eyes sarcastically as he glanced down at the glass between his fingers. "We'll never make it past the door." He gave the liquid a cautionary sniff. It smelled of lavender and honey. He sipped at it, only to find that it was not alcohol, but tea. One that he and his father used to share when the rains would cause power outages at work. A drink he only ever shared with one other person. He looked up at the Arcanist, his mouth hanging open in surprise. How did...
It's a bar for the divine. The cups are spelled to bring you whatever you crave.
Atlas waved him off.
Now, if we could get back to my plan...
No! Management will be watching us. Undine rolled her glass between her fingers. If we try anything right now while they are looking for trouble, we will be easy to spot. She set it down and watched as it refilled. We need to... Smack! Her reactionary instincts took over and Undine jumped to her feet as though she had been the one slapped. Instead, she was staring at the six-armed receptionist, Sirius, standing over the Arcanist, fury in his eyes. Atlas, nearly knocked from his chair by the surprise attack, pressed his fingers to his cheek and looked up.
Hi?
Don't you hi me.
Sirius slapped him again with hand number 2.
You haven't returned my notes, and today I was nearly murdered by a woman who you clearly have a thing for.
Hand number 3 reached over and struck him across the face in the opposite direction. Atlas recoiled, massaging both cheeks now.
What? No, it's not like that. She was trying to kill me. I don't fancy her.
Oh?
Sirius moved hands 4 and 5 to his hips as he flexed the fingers of hand number 6.
That's not what Evla said. You know, the ice goddess you seduced. Or Marvin from Janitorial.
Lucas recoiled. Not Marvin.
Yes, Marvin, along with a dozen other names.
Sirius raised hand number 6, but when the Arcanist attempted to block him, he simply slapped him from the other side, square in the jaw, with both hands 1 and 3, spinning the man clean out of his seat.
You hussy!
He swiveled on his heel, loftily waving hand 5.
I think I'll warn the rest of the staff about you.
No, wait!
Atlas shut out a noise of indignation and scrambled to his feet.
Those others meant nothing to me,
he wailed as he hobbled after the receptionist, moving as quick as his cast would allow. Bram took that moment to let out an absolutely thunderous mechanical belch. He made a show of turning over his empty bottle and straightened up.
I think I'll need to relieve this fine establishment of any further rum they may have.
Collapsing back into her chair, Undine fell into silence when she realized she was alone at the table with the other dryad. She grabbed her shot glass and threw it back, barely tasting the alcohol before she tapped it on the table. Can I ask you something? She watched her glass refill, adamantly ignoring him. Taking her silence for resignation, Lucas turned to face her. What did I do to piss you off? Because as far as I can tell, I've done nothing but save your ass. When she bared her teeth at him, he shook his head. Nah, I was the one to convince Atlas to take your case in with ours. If it wasn't for me, you'd still be stuck in that prison and I wouldn't have gotten 8 years in this place. But from the moment you saw this, he flicked his golden earring with one hand. You've been treating me like something smelly stuck to your shoe. What did I do? She had been hoping to avoid this particular conversation. Undine tossed back another gulp of liquid courage. It's not so much what you did, but who you are. She reached out a hand and tapped that swinging earring. A gift from your mother, yes? Lucas frowned as he touched it. Yeah, I suppose. Wrenching back the wrappings on her forearm, Undine revealed a swollen scar. I have a matching one. Lucas leaned over, taking in the faint pink skin that stretched over her dark forearm. It was the same design that was stamped into his earring, though slightly distorted by the healing process. That, or he realized with a twist in his gut, it had stretched as she had grown. He pulled the rectangle from the hoop and turned it over in his hand, his gaze flicking between the two. After a moment, he met those bright blue eyes and frowned. I don't understand. Of course you don't, because our mother never sticks around long enough to explain anything. Undine shoved her bindings back over the scar and drained the contents of her glass again, thankful for the slight buzz it was causing. She smacked her lips once more and turned to face the man. I got the banishment, and you got a happy childhood. How is that fair? Confused by the sudden swarm of bees that must have filled the tavern, Lucas could only hear angry buzzing in his head. The warrior dryad's words turned over and over in his mind, focusing on one in particular. Awa. Oi. He struggled with his tongue, his heart trapped in his throat. You're my sister? Undine wrinkled her nose at him. Off. Lucas slumped back into his chair, the world shifting out from beneath his feet. He had always wanted a sibling. A tenuous smile formed on his lips when something she said finally registered. Wait, a happy childhood? He let out a nervous laugh. Yeah, nah. My mom left when I was 4 or 5, and if my dad hadn't told me about her, I'd have no memories of her at all. 4 or 5 years was more than I ever got. Undine reclined back in her chair, ignoring the odd expression on his face, and folded her arms across her chest. Bastards are branded and assigned to the scullery maid that serviced the kitchen in the royal palace. And when I was finally old enough to wield a weapon, I was old enough to know my place in the world and was sent away from the Enshrined Wilds to serve as guardian to the Elven King. Anything you had growing up, I would have cherished. Lucas stared at her for a moment before he dropped his eyes. When she left, my dad was never the same. I think he loved her, truly. On nights where he'd had too much rye, he'd plant me on his knee and tell me about how a beautiful woman saved his life when he got lost in the forest. He sighed. Stories. That's all I have left. Undine snorted and downed another shot. Ah, sounds like her. Love at first sight, then poof. When my dad was nearing his end, he would ask for her, all the time. And it broke my heart to tell him she wasn't there. Tears pricked the corners of his vision. I don't think I could forgive her for that. I never had a mother, just him. Then he died, and I had to sell the only thing left of him I had, the shop. He glanced up. I don't have anyone or anything now. His face formed a watery smile. But wouldn't mind having a sister? Undine clicked her tongue against her teeth, but something in the cracking of his voice broke through her armor. She let out a slow hiss of air and gave him a sidelong glance. She wasn't good with emotions, but even she could recognize that look of scared and alone anywhere. Maybe I'm just drunk. She reached out and placed a hand on his. But I'm okay with that for now. She raised a finger, cutting off his excited reply. Don't think we're going to be all lovey-dovey, happy family. And keep this to yourself. No one else needs to know. Of course. Settling on a wide grin, Lucas swiveled his hand beneath her grip. Like that tiny cactus, she too was now his anchor in the storm, and just as prickly. He smiled and pulled his hand away when he felt her stiffen. He didn't want to push his luck. If you hate our mother... Undine reached for her shot glass and tapped it on the table, quickly downing the contents. She then flicked that dangling golden earring. Then why do you wear her symbol if not to remember her? A sharp pain jolted through him, causing those little shards of glass to stab his freshly wounded heart once more. I don't wear it to remember her. I wear it to remember someone else. Ah, yes. Undine nodded sagely, No, drunkenly. The cranky one. I always wondered where he got it. What was his name? Venison? Vanilla? Time stopped. Or maybe it had been his heart, as he couldn't feel it beating anymore. Vale. Oh, yeah, that's it. That's what it was. Red coat, gold earring, moody. Undine dragged out that last word. And so rude. But I got him back. She gave a drunken chuckle and leaned in close to whisper, I beat him. Lucas clutched his chest, struggling to breathe as he gripped the edge of the table. He's alive. As far as I know. When I left him, he was in the company of my queen and several others. She waved a hand flippantly in a random direction. They were near that glowing bubble. Atlas chose that exact moment to collapse into his seat, rubbing at one of his still sore cheeks.
I'll have you both know I take no joy in betting the staff.
He tossed back the now warm contents of his shot glass.
I'm trying to gather information, and as it so happens, I have the best plan for getting...
Lucas jumped from his seat and grabbed the Arcanist by the lapel of his jacket and hauled him in close. We need to get those contracts. Now! Somewhere, deep inside a tower made of stone, long, empty halls stretched on and on, twisting in on themselves like a tangled knot. And along one particular corridor was the echoing sound that could only come from someone struggling to fix a malfunctioning computer. On the other side of a large red door, Ravaria squinted through bleary eyes at a box filled with magic green text. Her fingers would tap on lettered bricks, and the same symbols would appear on the surface before her. Ingenious. Simple. But no matter the sequence she plugged in, no matter how many letters or numbers she pushed, nothing would activate the spinning rings above her head. She fell into the back of her chair with a long groan. I have the knowledge of the universe, several in fact, and I cannot figure this blasted thing out. She pulled the king's long white bangs out of her face. I don't understand this gibberish. Even searching through Elias's memory, nothing works. She pushed several more keys in random order this time and grumbled when, like all the previous attempts, nothing happened. At a dark chuckle from the other end of the table, she looked up. Are you going to be helpful, Shade? Or are you just going to sit there glaring daggers at me?
I'd prefer the latter, if it's all the same to you.
Alpha kept his arms crossed and the lazy smile on his stolen face.
No, you're part machine now. Get over here and speak to this infernal thing.
Ravaria pushed herself to her feet and gestured down at the blocky monstrosity on the table. Alpha let all four legs of his chair land back on the floor and stared at her incredulously.
You want me to wake the thing that kept me bound for years, just so it can type into this box for you?
He let out a mirthless laugh that crinkled the edges of his eyes. He laughed until his sides hurt and his lungs begged for air.
No, I don't think I will. If you're so smart, something as rudimentary as this, something that even that old wizard could handle, should be nothing.
He leaned back in his chair again, rocking it back and forth just to annoy her. Ravaria's fingers clenched in the open air, desperate with the need to wrap around her shade's neck. His borrowed body infuriated her, reminding her every day they spent together of the man that had almost killed her. She sucked in a deep breath through her nose and pulled straight the vest buttoned around her billowing white shirt.
Fine, but I can't stand the sight of you any longer. Here, this arrived earlier.
She turned and grabbed a ruddy scroll that sat next to the letter bricks and tossed it to him.
Go make yourself useful. Away from me.
Snatching the papers from the air, Alpha unfurled it and quickly read across the scrawled writing.
What the hell is a cavale?
You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
Excuse me, I'd like to partake of your finest rum, please.
Of course. Just give me a moment. I have to deliver these drinks and I'll be right back.
Problem, take your time. Now, what the hell? I've been known to know my way around the bar. Can't be too hard. Let's see here. Pardon me, just grabbing a bottle of this. Sorry.
Sir, you cannot be back there.
It's all right. I won't be but a moment.
I would be more than happy to help you if you just...
Ooh, that looks nice.
Please, sir, I could get in trouble.
No worries. I can serve myself.
Oh, watch out for the...
Oops.
Oh, no, that was expensive.
That wasn't my fault. Someone put the bottle in my way. Who wants a drinking contest?
No, not the Olympian ale. Oh, that was imported.
Ooh, that's tasty.
And he just drank the rare bottle of golden apple wine. I am so getting fired for this.
But where's the rum gone?